But there appears to be a lot of maneuvering behind both, frankly, I would say Bush and Rockefeller entities in setting Nixon up for the fall. The whole taping system was done, was revealed. His name was Butterfield. He was CIA. The fact that that all of Nixon's conversations were to be recorded, that was a Kissinger plan. Kissinger tends to be a protege of Rockefeller. You know, both Nelson Rockefeller and George H.W. Bush wanted to be president. And Nelson Rockefeller's ambitions were thwarted by two very loyal allies of George W. Bush. Do you know who they were?
No.
Their names are Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. And they were working for Ford and convinced Ford to drop Nelson as his running mate when Ford was going to run again for office. And Nelson never got over it, hated the men. And
but Bush Sr. was in charge of the CIA at one
that
point.
Was also, yes, that's true.
Was that during the Watergate?
Bush Sr., I'm trying to get the chronology straight on that. But Bush was in charge of the CIA under, I believe it was under, oh gosh, I'm getting it wrong. I think, under Ford. And meanwhile, Nelson was vice president. Okay.
But that's very interesting that while they were bugging the Democratic Convention and the Watergate Hotel, all this monkey business was going on while Bush Sr. was in charge of the CIA.
And the thing is that Bush Sr., a lot of people think that Bush Sr. got tapped for the CIA. He was sort of like this gray man. He didn't have that much experience. And one of the things that comes out of Russ Baker's book is that Poppy Bush, as he's known, was involved much longer with intelligence, going way, way back to the efforts to overthrow Cuba and to assassinate Castro in the late or early 60s, I should say. So he documents it. So, you know, the Bushes are a family of secrets, and all sorts of monkey business went on, but some of the people that were instrumental in getting slush funds to Nixon were directly tied into Bush's operation. And it was done in a way that would end up making Nixon look bad. So you got to read the book. I haven't reviewed it for a while, but it's all there. It's worth looking at. And once you read that book...
I will read it.
Once you read that book, then you come to understand that, that first of all, Poppy and Son are closer than one would think. And that even though Bush Jr. plays the dumb guy, he's not that dumb. And he's with a family that knows exactly what it's doing. And they succeeded. I mean, eventually, George H.W., he got the White House. And
George W. has an MBA, right? Nobody gets an MBA if they're dumb. Well, Charlotte, what do you think about the way that George Bush was elected president in 2000? And why did he take us to war in Iraq?
Well, boy, you know, it's interesting. When Bush was elected, quote unquote, my husband and I were on a tour of Brazil for our book, Thy Will Be Done. It's the one language the book got translated in was Portuguese, and we were on down there. And at that time, the whole election was in dispute, the hanging chads, the whole question of whether the Florida election that was so crucial to Bush's election had been rigged. And you know, the Brazilians were laughing because in Latin America, elections get rigged all the time. It just happens. They're almost used to it. They hate it, but it happens, and often it's our country that's behind it, you know, trying to get its people in. So there we were down there, and I remember thinking to myself that the fact that Bush would go to such great lengths to make sure that he got elected, even though it looked awful, even though it looked like it raised all sorts of questions about a tainted election, and finally it had to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the way they handled that was highly questionable. And I remember thinking to myself, boy, you know, he really wanted this presidency bad. To put up with all of that. What was it that he wanted? Well, it became clear later on. He wanted the oil of Iraq. And it's since come out in books that one of the first things he talked about when he got into the Oval Office was he wanted to get into Iraq. And
this is before 9/11,
before 9/11.
Yes.
And in fact, I believe it was his Treasury Secretary, O'Neill, who later writes in a book that it was like the #1 issue in a cabinet meeting, and that what Bush did was say to people, his advisors, find me a way. That's what he said. And that's something that I do document in the book. Obviously, 9/11 was certainly very helpful in finding the way because, you know, it gave a reason for going after terrorists, and the terrorists became the excuse to go to war. And so...
Find me a way, that's a really key word, I think.
I mean, that wasn't the exact wording, but it was a paraphrase. That was it. Find me the way. So what happened?
Are you familiar with the documents for the New American Century?
Oh yeah.
A few years earlier.
Yes, of course. All the neocons had their eye on the oil of Iraq.
So when they had to find the way, they could dig into the file system and pull out that document for the New American Century.
Well, that's true. I hadn't even thought of that precisely. I know what you're saying.
And
Are you talking about the new Pearl Harbor? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. Well, in any event, one set of people that were very important to finding the way were the lawyers in the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department, going by the name of John Yoo and Jay Bybee. You know, most people think of them as the torture lawyers, the ones that devised the interrogation techniques such as waterboarding and coming up with legal language to say that it wasn't illegal, when of course it was illegal. But people need to remember that, for instance, John Yoo, who was one of the major crafters of these torture memos, his expertise was to enhance the power of the presidency in a time of war. He had studied in undergraduate, he went to Harvard, and that became his thesis, was how did presidents increase their power during war. So in terms of find me a way, they needed a war. That was the first thing. And what they did with the 9/11 is they, even though previous attacks on large federal buildings like Oklahoma, and in fact the 1992 bombing of the World Trade Center was treated as a criminal act because these were individuals. I mean, it wasn't nations that were doing this, right? But with 9/11, what they did is they called it an act of war. And by calling it an act of war, you set to work to make it so that the president could achieve almost dictatorial powers. And so one of the first things that happened is in September, I think it was 21st, 2001, you crafted a memo about the military being able to go after any terrorists connected with 9/11, and actually had tried to basically, in an earlier draft, give carte blanche to the United States to go after terrorists anywhere in the world that threatened American security. And Tom Daschle, a leading Democrat, saw that and he said, "You're crazy, you can't do that." So what the Congress agreed to was to give Bush the power to at least go to war against any terrorists involved in 9/11. And then what we start to see is, but meanwhile, you comes up and starts doing secret documents, which, and you know, what happens when you're a country that has its laws done in secret? This is very dangerous. and quite unprecedented. And so you find that you and Bybee are charting the way to give the president huge executive power. They don't want to consult Congress. They see Congress as an impediment to their ambitions. And so